Have you ever noticed how rich people seem to talk about money differently, almost as if they're describing an entirely separate reality? In 2026, this difference isn't just about income or assets, it's about perception, timing, and how the world itself is interpreted. What if the biggest gap between rich and everyone else isn't opportunity, education, or even luck, but the way money is mentally framed? Why does money feel like a source of stress for most people, while for a few it feels more like a tool, a signal, or even a game board? And how is it possible that two people can look at the same economy, the same technology, the same crisis, and see completely opposite futures? Think about how most people relate to money on a daily basis. It's something to earn, protect, and spend carefully. It's tied to survival, stability, and fear of loss. But what if rich people don't start with money at all when they think about wealth? What if they start with systems, flows, leverage, and time? Why would someone with millions still obsess over efficiency, positioning, and optionality instead of comfort? And if money is no longer just currency but a representation of influence in a complex global system, how does that change every financial decision from the ground up? In 2026, rich people don't ask, "How much does this cost?" as often as they ask, "What does this connect me to?" That question alone changes everything. Why does connection matter more than ownership now? How is it possible that access can be more valuable than possession? When markets move at digital speed and opportunities appear and disappear in days, sometimes hours, owning the wrong thing can be a disadvantage. So what if wealth is no longer about accumulation, but about positioning yourself where value flows naturally? Most people are taught to think linearly about money. Work more, earn more, save more. But rich people tend to think non-linearly. They look for exponential outcomes, asymmetric bets, and situations where effort and reward are disconnected. Why would someone spend years building something that earns very little at first? Why would they accept uncertainty instead of stability? Could it be because they understand that in a world driven by networks, algorithms, and global platforms, small early advantages can compound into massive outcomes later? Time plays a strange role here. To most people, time is something to trade for money. Hours become wages, but to the wealthy in 2026, time is the most expensive resource there is. Why would someone pay a premium just to save time? How is it possible that losing money feels less painful than losing attention or flexibility? And what happens when you realize that money can be recovered, but lost time almost never can? Rich people tend to think in probabilities rather than guarantees. This mindset alone separates them from most financial advice taught in schools. Why do so many people seek certainty in an uncertain world? Why do they cling to fixed salaries, predictable paths, and familiar investments even when the environment is changing rapidly? And what if the wealthy accept uncertainty not because they enjoy risk, but because they understand how to manage it across many dimensions at once? In 2026, wealth is deeply tied to understanding systems. Financial markets, technology platforms, AI-driven decision engines, and global supply chains are no longer abstract concepts. They're the invisible infrastructure of money. Rich people spend a surprising amount of time learning how these systems behave, where they break, and who controls the rules. Why would understanding rules matter more than playing harder within them? And how is it possible that simply knowing where value leaks from a system can be more profitable than producing value yourself? There's also a subtle shift in how rich people view income. Most people see income as the goal. A higher salary, a bigger paycheck, more monthly cash flow. But the wealthy often see income as a side effect, not the objective. They focus on ownership, equity, control, and leverage. Why would someone accept a lower salary in exchange for upside? How is it possible that being paid less upfront can lead to vastly more wealth later? And what does that say about how delayed gratification works at a systemic level? In the AI-driven economy of 2026, rich people are acutely aware that intelligence itself has become leverage, but not intelligence in the traditional academic sense. It's not about memorizing facts or following procedures. It's about understanding patterns, incentives, and second-order effects. When a new technology emerges, most people ask how to use it. Rich people ask how it changes behavior, who gains power, who loses relevance, what becomes cheaper, and what suddenly becomes scarce. And if scarcity is where value concentrates, how do you position yourself near it before everyone else notices? Fear operates differently as well. For many people, fear is a stop signal. It prevents action, reinforces caution, and keeps decisions small. But rich people often treat fear as information. Why does discomfort sometimes indicate opportunity rather than danger? How is it possible that situations that feel risky on the surface can actually be safer when viewed through a system's lens? And what happens when you train yourself to distinguish between emotional risk and structural risk? Another major difference lies in how rich people think about consumption. Most people see spending as a reward. You earn, then you spend. But the wealthy often see spending as a strategy. Every expense is evaluated based on return, leverage, or long-term impact. Why would someone spend aggressively on education, tools, or networks while being frugal about status symbols? How is it possible that appearing modest can actually preserve flexibility and optionality in ways flashy consumption never can? In 2026, information is abundant, but insight is rare. Rich people don't try to know everything. They try to know the right things early. They build filters, not just knowledge. Why does consuming less information sometimes lead to better decisions? How is it possible that being selective about inputs can dramatically improve outcomes in a noisy digital world? And what role does attention play in wealth creation when algorithms constantly compete for it? Rich people also think differently about failure. For most, failure is something to be avoided, hidden, or deeply feared, but the wealthy often see failure as data. What went wrong? Why? Under what conditions would it work next time? How is it possible to fail repeatedly and still move forward financially? The answer often lies in scale and containment. They structure decisions so failures are survivable, while successes are allowed to grow. Why isn't this taught early? And what would happen if more people understood how to design their lives around asymmetric outcomes? Debt is another area where thinking diverges sharply. Most people are taught to avoid debt entirely, associating it with danger and loss of freedom. Rich people separate bad debt from strategic leverage. Why would someone borrow money even when they can afford not to? How is it possible that debt, when aligned with cash flowing or appreciating assets, can accelerate wealth instead of destroying it? And why does misunderstanding debt keep so many people locked out of opportunities that require leverage to access? In 2026, global thinking is no longer optional for the wealthy. Even local businesses are affected by global trends, currencies, and regulations. Rich people pay attention to macro signals, not because they predict the future perfectly, but because they want to avoid being blindsided. Why does understanding global movement matter even if you never leave your country? How is it possible that decisions made halfway across the world can affect your personal finances within days? There is also a profound difference in how rich people view stability. To most, stability means predictability. A steady job, a routine income, familiar patterns. But the wealthy often see stability as resilience, the ability to adapt when conditions change. Why would someone willingly build a life with variable income but strong optionality? How is it possible that flexibility can be safer than rigidity in a fast-moving economy? And what happens when the world changes faster than fixed plans can keep up? Rich people in 2026 are deeply aware that money follows trust, reputation, credibility, and reliability act as invisible currencies. Why does trust open doors that money alone cannot? How is it possible that people with strong reputations can raise capital, attract talent, and access opportunities faster than those with cash, but no credibility? And why is trust so difficult to rebuild once it's broken? There's also the uncomfortable truth that rich people are comfortable being misunderstood. Their decisions often look irrational to outsiders. Why would someone quit a secure job? Why would they invest in something unproven? Why would they walk away from short-term gains for long-term positioning? How is it possible that looking wrong in the present can be the price of being right later? And what psychological strength does that require in a world obsessed with immediate validation? In the digital economy, rich people think in platforms rather than products. They ask how value is distributed, who controls access, and how rules can change. Why build on someone else's platform if you don't understand the risks? How is it possible that entire fortunes can rise and fall based on algorithm updates, policy changes, or shifts in user behavior? And why does this make adaptability more valuable than any single skill? Even generosity is viewed differently. To many, giving feels like loss. To the wealthy, it can be an investment in relationships, reputation, and long-term influence. Why does contribution sometimes create more opportunity than accumulation? How is it possible that helping others succeed can indirectly strengthen your own position? And what does this say about wealth as a social phenomenon rather than a purely individual one? One of the most striking differences is how rich people think about learning. They don't stop learning when formal education ends. In fact, That's often when learning becomes most intense. Why would someone with financial security still study markets, psychology, technology, and history obsessively? How is it possible that continuous learning acts as a form of insurance against obsolescence? And what happens to those who assume their existing knowledge will always be enough? In 2026, rich people are also keenly aware of narrative. The stories society tells about money, success, and failure shape behavior at scale. Why does believing a story influence outcomes? How is it possible that internal narratives can limit or expand opportunity? And what happens when you realize that many widely accepted beliefs about money benefit the system more than the individual? Perhaps the biggest shift is how rich people think about control. Not control over others, but control over variables. They design lives where fewer decisions are forced upon them. Why does optionality matter so much? How is it possible that having multiple paths reduces stress even if you only take one? And what does it mean to build a life where you can say no to bad deals, toxic environments, or misaligned opportunities? As all of this unfolds in 2026, one thing becomes clear. Rich people don't see money as the finish line. They see it as a tool for shaping reality. They think about cause and effect, leverage and exposure, systems and incentives. They ask questions others don't think to ask, not because they are smarter in a traditional sense, but because they have trained themselves to look at the world differently. So the real question becomes, what if thinking like rich people isn't about copying lifestyles or chasing status, but about adopting a different mental framework entirely? What if the gap between financial struggle and financial freedom begins not with money, but with how money is understood? And if that understanding can be learned, questioned, and refined, then what else might be possible for those willing to think beyond the rules they were given, especially in a world where the rules keep changing faster than ever before?